Thank you. Good evening. Hello. Greetings. Welcome to the first program of our fall season at CBH. Excited for this. My name is Marcia Eli. It's my pleasure to greet you on behalf of the Center for Brooklyn History, the Brooklyn Public Library, and my colleagues at BPL's Arts and Culture Department, BPL Presents. During the pandemic, we had the honor of hosting a virtual program with Howard French about his last book, Born in Blackness. It was one of my favorite CBH conversations because it was perspective changing. That book put Africa and Africans at the center of the thinking about the origins of modernity. And by the way, that conversation was recorded and is posted on YouTube, and I'm happy to share the link with anyone who wants to listen. It's had upwards of 6,000 views. So tonight, I am absolutely thrilled that Howard French is back at CBH, this time in person, to discuss his newest book, The Second Emancipation. The Second Emancipation tells the story of decolonization and Pan-Africanism through the complicated life and legacy of Ghana's visionary first Prime Minister, Kwame Nkrumah. As French said in a recent interview, this is not a biography. It's about the history of an idea, and the idea is Black solidarity. Just as Born in Blackness showed that the making of the modern world isn't just a story about Europe, the Second Emancipation brings us into the post-war era, the end of European domination of Africa, and the fertile times of change on the continent with a virtual explosion of new African nations. In 1960 alone, 17 countries in Africa obtained independence. We're going to hear about all of this and what it means shortly. French is a professor of journalism at Columbia University and a former New York Times bureau chief for Central America and the Caribbean, West and Central Africa, Japan, and the Koreas and China. We are absolutely thrilled that he'll be led in conversation tonight by historian Annette Gordon-Reed, the Carl M. Loeb University professor at Harvard University, and author of the Pulitzer Prize-winning book, The Hemingses of Monticello. After their discussion, we'll open up to questions from all of you. Our ushers will bring the mic to your seat. Please just try to keep your questions brief. And then following the program, Howard will sign books. You can purchase them at the CBH shop if you haven't already. You passed it as you walked in. It's over there in the corner. And he'll be at a table in the front there by the door that you walked in. So I want to thank you both so much for bringing this conversation to CBH. It's really exciting to host you here. Please help me welcome Howard French and Annette Gordon-Reed.
Well, it's good to finally meet you in person after reading your work, and you said you've read mine, so we're here together to talk. How did you get into writing this book? I mean, what was the impetus for it?
I, first of all, have to say thank you to you. I've met you before. We were on a flight to, both of us speaking at Notre Dame.
That's right.
It was a small commuter plane. I was across the aisle of this very crowded flight in the middle of the winter, I think from Chicago to Indiana. And
I just remember, that is
and
totally...
I'm sitting on the other side of the aisle thinking, fanboy, do I dare speak to her? And I gathered my courage and I said, hello, and you seemed to have your thoughts somewhere else, which is totally fine. You said hello. And then the next time I saw you, we were both checking into the same hotel together. So this is the second time.
I think about you through books. Through your books.
Thank you so much. I'm still a fanboy. How did I get into this? This is such a complicated question. It's a natural place to start. I got into this, first of all, through family history. My family, some of my family history relates to your first book, or The Jeffersons of Monticello. I come from a family background that is not unlike that of Sally Hemings, on land very close by to the Jefferson estate, which miraculously, some of which has remained in my family's hands. And so I grew up totally aware of the story, unusually aware, I should say, of the story of slavery in the United States, and of and alert to its implications. My parents moved to West Africa as I was entering college, moved to Ivory Coast, which is Ghana's neighbor to the west. And I began traveling as a student to Ghana about a decade after Nkrumah had been overthrown. And just so by virtue of that experience, the whole Nkrumah story began to penetrate me, and I eventually married a woman from that very part of Ghana, and so that's another family piece of this story. Skipping one step, I had studied, as the British would say, I had read Africa in college. And so I was alert politically in a sort of academic, intellectual way to all of this already. And then a career in journalism took off, and I went all over, almost literally all over the world, and got away from this and came back to it most immediately by virtue of an editor that we've shared in common, Bob Weil, who begged me basically for a year or two to write a book about Nkrumah. And so I let that sit with me and thought for a long time before saying yes, but here it is.
Tell us about Nkrumah. I mean, who was this? I mean, we don't really have anybody like that now. Why not? And what made him special?
We don't have anybody like our founding fathers in the United States either. These moments happen once in history, and they tend to throw up very special people for whatever reason. Nkrumah is this character who, really a self-made person in many regards. Born in one of the most remote and neglected parts of Ghana, in the far southwest of the country, almost right on the border with Ivory Coast. Poor family. Early part of the 20th century, at a time when Britain had scarcely invested anything at all in education locally in a very lucrative colony. Nkrumah was the child of a junior wife of his mother. What that means is his father had several wives. He was her only child. He was not his father's first son. Nothing predestined Nkrumah to go to school. Nkrumah's junior wife, mother, persuaded his father, of all of his children, and he had a number of children, to somehow sacrifice whatever budget they could sacrifice or allot to education. Nkrumah goes to a one-room schoolhouse a Catholic schoolhouse in southwestern Ghana. Immediately impresses the priest who runs the school. A colonial official comes touring the sort of provincial part of Western Ghana and is impressed by Nkrumah, and by dint of coincidence, this happens just as the British are opening, because a progressive governor had been put in charge of the colony for the first time, opening a boarding school, which they called a college, but was really a fancy high school for a future elite, so to speak, of the country. And Nkrumah was in the first class of that school. He arrives in Accra, the capital, to study in this special place, and he falls quickly under the influence of two very important people in terms of his early life. His whole life is sort of marked by these kinds of coincidences.
That's the amazing thing of reading about it, is that these people appear in his life who as mentors and helping. Well, the mother is the first person, is extraordinary, and her devotion to him and her belief in him. And then he has these people outside who come along and help him along as well.
Right, but pushing him in the direction of Pan-Africanism and eventually to politics, something happens quite early at Achimota College, this school. One of the schoolmasters is, the only black schoolmaster is a man named Kwegwir Agre, who had been to Columbia University and who was a Pan-Africanist. He believed strongly in the value of his identity as a black person, and he spoke eloquently about that. And he had ideas about the need for black people to pool their resources and their political forces beyond a single colony for the good of Africa. At the same time, he falls under the influence of a crusading newspaper editor who happened to be from Nigeria, a man named Nnamdi Azikiwe, who, another big coincidence, would go on to be the first president of Nigeria. Think of the chances, right?
The chances, the odds of that happening.
And Azikiwe is this crusading newspaper editor who is pushing in the direction of independence. He's taking big risks with a locally owned newspaper, writing and sponsoring editorials that attack the British for their hypocrisy in denying democratic rights to Ghanaians. Or it was not called Ghana yet, but I'm just, for simplicity, going to keep saying Ghana. And so his mind is fired already at this early age, high school age, basically, with these things. They persuade him that he should go to the United States and not to Britain to study. This turns out to be a really pivotal thing. And with that, he's kind of on his way. I don't want to get ahead of your question, but
but that's to come to the United States as opposed to Great Britain, thinking that it offered him a chance to see the world in a different way, or.
Well, I think Agre and Azikiwe both. Azikiwe had been to Lincoln University, which is in Pennsylvania, and the oldest, or certainly one of the oldest historically black colleges and universities. Both of these men had feelings about, very few people went to Britain from the African colonies to study. And the people who did were being deliberately trained by the British to become as the sort of incipient ruling elite at some distant eventual time, right? And Azikiwe... Way into the future, right? And Azikiwe and Agre both thought that if you go to study in Britain, you'll sort of be infected with a kind of colonial sense of history and of Ghana's place in the world, and that you won't have a sense of urgency. You won't have these other ideas about black unity or about Pan-Africanism. And so, at the time when Nkrumah was of age to go to university, the United States was not just, by that time, a very rich and powerful country, but a place where lots of ideas were there was a lot of effervescence around blackness. And Nkrumah lands in Harlem, and amazing things start to happen right away.
Yeah, very different Harlem than London or Oxford. Very, very different places. The culture would be
Absolutely
real there.
Right. So the Harlem of 1935, where he lands on his way to Pennsylvania, is just an incredibly fertile place. Every street corner, there's people kind of preaching one message or another, politically or religiously or both. And this sort of opens a window for Nkrumah onto a world of explicit activism that he had not seen before. And I think plants a seed for what comes later.
And what's heartening about this story is the help he got. I mean, because it was a struggle for him, but there were people looking out for him during that time period. I guess that happens all the time, but the sense of community is palpable.
Well, there was a Nigerian guy. There's some of these stories. The first parts of the book, fittingly, I think, are about him becoming Nkrumah, right? And so in Harlem, he's taken in by a Nigerian guy named Dosumu, who is far ahead of him in terms of developed thoughts about the place of Africa in the world and Pan-Africanism. Very progressive, one might say radical thinker already. Not too much older than Nkrumah, but he takes Nkrumah in. And Nkrumah's just there for a period of a week or two initially in Harlem, and then comes back his next year. He's very poor, Nkrumah is. He's talked his way into school. Azikiwe and Agre wrote the recommendations that get him into Lincoln. He's talked his way into school. Some of the correspondence is reproduced in the book. He doesn't have the means to pay for school.
Yeah.
I don't know if you can do that
No, I was
nowadays.
going to say that the world is so different there that people, this kind of serendipitous things that people can just try and it works out that would not work now.
Right, but part of this is force of will. Part of this is just his, a budding talent that is already becoming apparent to persuade. And he has to figure out in Pennsylvania how to make a living, how to pay he makes a commitment to the school. I'll work off my tuition debt. And he begins to do a variety of things. One of them is homework for other students. Nkrumah was a brilliant student. He accumulates 4 degrees in short order, and he's just a standout. And so he stays up all night reading on his own and then does homework for pay for other students. I'm not sure if that's absolutely above board, ethically
Not
speaking.
supposed to do that as a professor, I could say.
No, I agree with you, but it worked.
But it worked for him, and it probably he learned a lot, I suppose.
Learned a ton. And he had been raised in Catholic schools in Ghana and had actually thought quite seriously about becoming a Jesuit priest. And so he had a lot of theology in him. I think he was, in fact, a believer. But to make money, he says, well, I can preach. And so he inserts himself in this world of Protestant churches, Baptist and other, black churches in the mid-Atlantic, and he becomes a kind of roving weekend substitute preacher for churches where they were in need of somebody to stand in, right? And this becomes really, really important to him in terms of rhetorical skill and being able to read an audience and just being nimble on your feet. Really important, I think. Another thing he does, this is not about ideas, so to speak, but it just shows you his mettle and also some of the comic side. This early part of his life I found quite entertaining.
Oh, it's fascinating.
Yeah. So he goes back, he's so struck by Harlem, he goes back to New York each summer. The school is closed. He can't board at Lincoln in the summer. He's got to go somewhere. So he goes to Harlem and he begins. His first job in Harlem is he becomes a fishmonger. He pushes a cart around in Harlem selling, fish on ice blocks, and he discovers that he's allergic to fish. And he breaks out in hives all the time, and of course he must have smelled like high heaven. And he did that as long as he could make it, and then he got a job in a paint factory. And this is like almost very similar to Invisible Man in some ways by Ellison. And I just was very struck by the pluck that he demonstrated in just being able to stay afloat while he managed to get all of that study in.
What fascinated me too is I had never thought about this, about Garvey, Marcus Garvey, and what you were talking about, the new ideas, people on the corners talking about this and that. I thought of Garvey mainly from the American side, and Du Bois's response to him, and other people's response to him. But he was a big deal in Africa, among Africans as well.
Absolutely. So I mentioned Ellison, and Ellison and Invisible Man come up in the book repeatedly because these periods coincide, and that's the world that Ellison is portraying, an Invisible Man, of these soapbox, orators in Harlem, and selling different ideologies. I don't think Garvey's name appears in Invisible Man, but Garvey, in that, this is where Azikiwe and Aggrey already knew well of Garvey in Africa, and the reason for that is that Garveyism produced newspapers. In fact, Garvey's background was in newspapering in Jamaica. Before he became the Garvey we know, he was in the newspaper business. So when Garveyism becomes a real thing, a movement in the 1920s, it is transmitted throughout coastal Africa by, black people who are working ships, and they arrive in ports all up and down the coast of mostly of West and all the way to Southern Africa with copies of Garvey's press and this won converts. This is how, in fact, Aggrey himself becomes a Garveyite. Nkrumah gets this direct exposure in Harlem, and he goes on to say, as I cite in the book, that Garvey was certainly in the early part of his life the most important influence in terms of thinking about the black world.
So when he's at a predominantly, well, black school, totally black school, probably Lincoln. How did you get along with people?
This is a really interesting question, and I suspect it's going to lead to some other questions on this topic of the relationship between African Americans and Africans. This is
We can do that now. I mean, they're linked.
well.
We don't have to go chronologically.
Let me answer the Lincoln piece of it, and then you tell me if you want me to keep going.
Okay.
So at Lincoln, well, this is the 1930s. Initially, there was a small number of African students. By a decade later at Howard University, which is of course not Lincoln, the number of African students had begun to explode. And this was a really big moment in terms of Black internationalism, and Howard University played a huge role in this. But Lincoln was kind of forerunner of that. And I think Nkrumah found, I think that the dozen or 20 African students, whatever the number was, at Lincoln in Nkrumah's time, generally found the environment not to be terribly friendly. And I do not want to overread that. I don't think they meant by that African Americans were unfriendly to them. What I think, the sense that I got in the research is that they just felt these two parts of the student body, that they just came from very different places.
Yeah.
The African American students at Lincoln were very typically sort of people who were aiming to get anchored in the American middle class through professions and through the standard gauges of material attainment in the United States. You be a doctor, a lawyer, a dentist, or whatnot, and there are, material signs that gauge your success along the way as you're striving in that direction. And the African students had other preoccupations. And first of all, they didn't have the option, generally speaking, of becoming American doctors and lawyers.
Yeah.
But they had countries to think about, or colonies that were going to become countries to think about, and a whole world on the other side of the Atlantic that was totally unfamiliar to the American students. And so they didn't, I think that they generally didn't find they had so much in common to talk about. That was the main issue. Nkrumah, though, becomes this real character, which I depict, in one chapter of the book, this unique character who's able really to converse with both worlds and who can draw a crowd around him and in today's language, sort of the language of, let's say, of rap and hip hop, he could spit. Nkrumah would gather a crowd around him and just talk, and it would, kind of enthrall people, and they would be wowed by this. And wherever they started out, I'm not really interested in these other people. By the time, once they gave them a little chance, they found, so they had these rap sessions, once a week at a assigned place on the campus, and Nkrumah was the most popular character on that scene and was known to draw and to hold crowds.
Mm-hmm. So rap, you mean in the way that we old people think about rap, that means to talk, a rap session, not actual rap. But he was a good communicator. It makes sense. I mean, people like that who become who he became had to have this spark that, that made people, that drew people to him and so forth. And so even if others didn't feel that they could make a connection, it's not surprising that he could. You said that the Africans here had countries to think about that in the future, that they might be on their own. What's sparking this? Where is this coming from? What's happening in the world that's making them think, I've just about had enough of the Brits, enough of the French?
Well, so we're talking about the mid-1930s, mid to late 1930s, and a whole lot has happened in their generation. First of all, they're not too young to know the aftermath of the First World War. And the First World War is, the two World Wars were incredibly important in terms of, they're called World Wars for a reason, right? And the most immediate reason is obvious, because people were fighting. But they're world wars also because they transformed the social and political landscape of the world pretty much everywhere at the same time, or in consequence of the fighting, right? And Africa was no different. Britain, the students at Lincoln would have almost entirely been from British colonies. Britain, France was like this too, but let's just speak about the Lincoln students. Britain had recovered from World War I in part by milking its colonies very explicitly, very deliberately, milking its colonies for all they were worth in order to restore consumption back home, in order to fill the treasury, replenish the treasury in Britain, et cetera. And Africans were aware of this. You know, Agre and Azikiwe was already writing about this in the newspapers in Ghana before Nkrumah left. And so these students at places like Lincoln and elsewhere where Africans arrived in the United States already are awake to the contradictions and hypocrisies of colonialism and aware of the fact that contrary to the rhetoric about the white man's burden and that, you know, there's a civilizing mission that Europeans have, an obligation to kind of bring Africans into the world of modernity, you know, as if this was a generous act. The African students knew this was nonsense, and that Britain was charging them for the luxury of being colonized, and in the meantime, essentially subsidizing life in Britain. And so there was some political awareness already. And on the social level, what they're thinking about these students that made them so different from the African-American Lincoln students. I think Lincoln had, in that era, a particular reputation as a kind of bourgeois prep school kind of place. Like, these African students are struggling mentally with where will they fit into the landscape of their colonial homelands, which were places that where the British had ceded very little in terms of space for political roles or even professional roles. And so, you know, I have students from various countries now in graduate school here, China for one, who wonder, because I teach journalism, how do I go back to China and be a journalist? China, you know, I'm not trying to change the topic. I'm not trying to change the topic here, but China being a place where journalism has lots of known constraints, right? And so you try to think.
We do too.
We do too. They're different, I assure you. So far. These African students are thinking, how do I go? What do I do when I go back? I know I want to go back. In fact, I pretty much have to go back. What can we do? How can we make a road for ourselves forward, a path forward to be able to make something of ourselves in a place where things are so skewed against the interests of Africans?
I ask it because we were talking earlier about war and how war transforms societies. I mean, war is bad. You know, what is it good for? Absolutely nothing. But there are
That's
things
a song, by the way.
By the way, old people remember that too. It opens people to things. Certainly World War I, World War II. We were talking about the fact that, and you discussed this in the book, in the 30s, obviously they're thinking about what happened in World War I, but in World War II, there are Black troops, there are Blacks who are part of, they helped save Europe, African people, you know, in the colonies, and that's not something that we think about very much or people know about. I was telling him that I remember reading an article where people were indignant in a movie that was made where they had Indian troops, and people were saying, you're just being woke or something. You know, they didn't say woke, but you know what I mean, that you're just doing this because this is something modern. There were no Black people, but as you point out, that this is really something that was the contribution that they made to saving Europe, who is then, you know, has their foot on their neck.
Right. So the figure I use in the book is that roughly 1 million Africans fought in World War II on behalf of European powers. Beyond that, many more Africans, perhaps an order of magnitude more Africans, were involved in things like forced labor, meaning you have to farm commodities and you're not paid a wage for that in order to support the European war effort, or you have to work essentially as beasts of burden in overland transport, ferrying commodities or materials on behalf of European armies, et cetera. So there's all of that. With regard to Britain specifically, and coming back to Ghana, Ghana played, you said the African forces saved European countries in World War II to some extent, and that's exactly right. The Ghanaian troops tended to be disproportionately sent to the front in Burma, and they played a very major role. Britain did horribly in World War II in terms of land warfare, and this was one of the big successes in British war, land war in World War II, and the Ghanaian troops, they were Gold Coast troops formerly, at the time, played an enormous role, a decisive role in terms of, I use the phrase, I think, in the book, saving the bacon of Britain in Burma, which was a very hard-fought front in the war. Those troops come back, and here comes the part of the answer about transformation. Troops come back from having made these sorts of contributions and sacrifices, knowing that they've put their lives on the line, that they've had their comrades die, knowing that they played the decisive role, and they expect something. Mm-hmm. They don't have any, if they had any doubt before about their worth or their valor, mm-hmm. they don't have those doubts anymore. And so troops came back from European wars in World War II, in British and in French colonies, with the idea that they had earned rights mm-hmm. that had thus far been denied to them, and that they were not going to be deterred in demanding them. And so this sets the kind of proximate background in the immediate post-war era for what becomes Nkrumah's rise.
Mm-hmm. And African American soldiers come back, and they're fighting on a different front and different reason, because this is their country and our country, but they're a minority here. Nkrumah and the other Africans going back to places that is their homeland, and they are in the majority there, and they're out of power, and so it makes sense that they want to have power. So he comes back, and when he comes back to his country, the stage is set for the transformation that I was talking about.
Sure. The war primed the situation for the struggle for independence. Mm-hmm. And I don't want to skip past this war business too quickly, because one of the most, for me as the author, one of the most important things about the book, or traits of the book, is the intertwined history of the struggle for freedom and rights in Africa and in the United States. And the same thing is happening in the United States. In World War I, W.E.B. Du Bois caught hell among African Americans for saying that African Americans have to fight. The government didn't want African Americans to fight. Du Bois said we have to fight in the war in order to kind of prove to validate our demand for true citizenship. Mm-hmm. And a lot of people criticized, a lot of black people criticized Du Bois for that, saying, listen, we're not going to be treated right no matter what. How could you, of all people, say that we should contribute to an imperial war, right? Mm-hmm. By World War II, the sentiment had spread much more widely in black society. People like A. Philip Randolph and many other people were pushing we had to push, African Americans had to push to be allowed to fight, to fully participate in combat in World War II. It was not something ceded or granted to African Americans. And they also came back saying, we have earned our civil rights now. Not that we didn't deserve civil rights before, but this is kind of proof of concept. We put our lives on the line. We militated for the participation in the war, and now we are going to demand our due. So these two things are happening simultaneously in the United States and in Africa, Ghana in particular, in terms of this story. And this is the beginning of a very intricate kind of back and forth, or intertwining of the histories of black people on both sides of the ocean. Mm-hmm.
And he's responsible. How does he foster this?
Well, initially, Nkrumah doesn't really foster this. Nkrumah is Mr. Accident in the beginning. Like, he's leading this accidental life. All these accidents, I've described a lot of them, are happening to him. He is in London. He leaves the United States in 1945 to go to the UK. He thinks he's going to study law, and he falls in with the student movement, progressive student, African student movements in London. He gets into a political relationship with a guy named George Padmore, who's this global black activist of incredible energy and kind of dynamism. He begins to discover a political vocation for himself, but Nkrumah goes back to Ghana, what was going to become Ghana, almost by accident. There's an elite, very kind of low-key, proto-political party run by lawyers who think that eventually they're going to be the leaders of Ghana, but they're not up to demanding independence yet. And because they had been part of this tiny elite that had gone to Britain to school, and they were well established and pretty well off financially.
And lawyers.
And lawyers.
I can say that as a lawyer.
They felt they didn't know how to talk to the common people. And so they wrote to the student association, the Africanist Student Association in London, and said, can you recommend somebody for us who we can hire, maybe make a secretary general of our group? It wasn't called a party yet, and employ this person as kind of a transmission belt for us. He can be the person who relates to the unwashed public. And so this is how Nkrumah comes back to home. It comes back to Gold Coast, which then very quickly becomes Ghana. The reason it becomes Ghana quickly is because of the war. In 1945, the war ends. African soldiers start coming back from Burma and other places if they were Ghanaian. Britain reneged on all sorts of promises to them about pensions and health benefits and things like that. And they organized a protest, which turns into a massacre and then a riot. And Nkrumah had nothing to do with that. Nkrumah was out of town. And he rushes back to town and to lend his... Nkrumah was not a well-known figure yet, but he rushes back in town. He senses how important this is. He makes, certain proclamations in support of all of this. Actually, statements issued to the international press. Somehow he got these out. And the British arrest Nkrumah and put him away in jail. And it is from that position of sort of martyrdom that Nkrumah builds his political career.
He becomes like a pre-Mandela story?
Sure. He's locked up. He's deprived of political rights. I don't think he was being cynical about this. I don't think he's plotted to take over or to capture the momentum of this movement. It just happens this way. And he writes a manifesto for a new party. He makes a break with the old conservative lawyers. The British, sensing how much pressure they're under, agree to have elections, and not for independence, but for some degree of local rule. And Nkrumah wins the election by a landslide from jail. He writes a manifesto on toilet paper, which he secrets out of the prison and gives orders to his lieutenants in this brand new political party. And they put together a brilliant campaign whose slogan is independence now. And this wins the election.
And war figures in this as well, because one of the interesting things that's in the book that when you think about it, it makes perfect sense, as I said when we were talking earlier. But Kennedy and the American response to what's going on in Africa. John F. Kennedy, who was kind of lukewarm on civil rights for American blacks, was a big champion of African independence. What was that all about?
Kennedy, you all know, was from a very young age an ambitious person. He came from a politically powerful family with a lot of money, and his older brother was initially supposed to be the guy who's going to become president. The older brother dies in an accident, and so the father pushes John F. Kennedy forward. Kennedy runs for the Senate. He wins a seat from Massachusetts. And right away, he's thinking about how do I become the nominee for the Democratic Party. He's making all of these calculations, fine calculations, cynical calculations about how to finesse his way to the nomination. And he's figuring, I'm a Catholic. That's a new and kind of difficult thing in America, politically speaking. So I can't take too many risks. There's already this post-war push for we tend to think of the civil rights movement in this country as being a thing of the 50s and 60s. It's underway in the 40s, full-blown.
Under the way in the 20s.
I mean, yes, but
Really, I know what you mean.
There's a fight for civil rights underway in the 19th century.
Yeah,
But
yeah.
Frederick Douglass was pushing for civil
Yeah,
rights. But the flavor of it is very similar already in the 1940s, right? And so I think we're wrong to truncate our popular way of thinking about that civil rights era, limiting it to the 50s. And so Kennedy's kind of undecided, how many risks can I take? I'm being charitable here. He's like, I can't, if I support people reached out to him, and he calculated that if I go out on a limb and support civil rights, I might win votes in the North, but I'm going to lose the South, and then I'll probably jeopardize my chance to gain the nomination. And so he plays a very passive and sometimes somewhat hostile role to the civil rights agenda as a senator. But very interestingly, Kennedy, already as a senator, is very interested in Africa. And I don't think that I don't get the sense that he was weighing these two things against each other, that being in favor of African independence, which he was at an early time, is going to make up for his ambivalence or hostility towards civil rights. It just happened that way. And Kennedy's become, he enters the Foreign Relations Committee and he's making speeches. He's mentioning Africa all the time. We don't have people in the Foreign Relations Committee today who are mentioning Africa all the time. Kennedy's, talking about Africa all the time. And this becomes very important because, of course, the story, Kennedy wins the presidency. And Kennedy, just as Nkrumah has emerged as the most important political figure in Africa. And Nkrumah becomes the first leader from anywhere in the world welcomed to the White House, which is just another unthinkable thing. And
it is unthinkable.
Yeah, just unthinkable. And Nkrumah and Kennedy formed this very curious and complicated bond that lasted until Kennedy's death. They stay in pretty constant communication, and Kennedy is in the midst of the Cold War. Kennedy has his own calculus. Obviously, political and geopolitical calculations involve, competition with the Soviet Union and the like. But I think there's a personal thing going on between him and Nkrumah, where Kennedy is trying to see how far he can have the United States go in supporting the agenda of Nkrumah. All the while, Kennedy's national security apparatus is telling him, be careful with this guy. He's really a kind of crypto-communist, or he's going to, if we give him anything, he's going to betray us later and get in bed with the Soviets or things like that. Kennedy never totally gets on board with Nkrumah, but he maintains an engagement with Nkrumah and strings Nkrumah along, actually, if you want to look at the narrow facts, about providing American financial backing, not loans, but loan guarantees for Nkrumah's most important economic initiative, which is the construction of a gigantic hydroelectric dam on the major lake in Ghana. And Kennedy, because of his advisors, Kennedy makes Nkrumah wait a terribly long period of time before finally signing off, which he does, and the dam then gets built, and Kennedy gets killed, and Nkrumah eventually, I'm getting ahead of myself, but Nkrumah eventually gets overthrown because, in large part, because his economic program had been crippled.
Mm-hmm. So his plan was an infrastructure plan to start with? I mean, what did he want to accomplish when he took office?
Well, Nkrumah's most important idea of all, of course, is Pan-Africanism, which is in the title of the book. And Nkrumah wants to forge greater political entities, larger entities than the colonies that had been bequeathed by the Berlin Conference of 1884, 1885, when Europe divided up the African continent. Nkrumah saw from a very early time that Africa's sort of cookie-cutter countries were not going to be economically viable. They didn't have the scale either to be economically viable. They wouldn't have large enough markets. They couldn't industrialize. They wouldn't be able to fend for themselves in a hostile world, et cetera, unless they forged some kinds of sub-regional and then regional and then perhaps ultimately continental, new continental polities, right? Mm-hmm. So that's his big idea. His economic idea, which is your question, is where can I find the energy to make this happen? And I'm not being cute by using the word energy. His answer was Ghana had tremendous hydroelectric resources, great river systems. Let me build an extraordinary dam. Ghana had world-class bauxite deposits. With the electricity from the hydroelectric dam, I can not only electrify my country, which the British did not do, but we can make industrial goods with aluminum and perhaps eventually with other things like steel using cheap electricity. Mm-hmm. And the political piece of this, and so that's just initially at the first sort of level of analysis, that's the domestic economic consideration. But political consideration for Nkrumah is Pan-Africanist. Uh-huh. I will give cheap electricity to all of my neighbors, maybe even free electricity to all of my neighbors, mm-hmm. and thereby convince them of the need to see beyond the narrow self-interests of these cookie-cutter colonies, that if we can marshal our forces, if we can come together, if we can make sacrifices for a greater good, we will all come out better, right? And as I've already told you, Kennedy strings him along tragically, really, and collapse of cocoa prices. Cocoa is Ghana's major export product. Collapse of cocoa prices in the early 1960s are the other thing that kind of crippled Nkrumah or his government economically, and this all comes to naught.
What about the CIA?
What about the CIA?
Well, you tell us about the CIA.
So the short answer is the CIA was involved at some level, and I'm being careful here because I don't think we actually know altogether the exact degree of involvement. I'm comfortable in saying that the CIA was aware of a host of plots against Nkrumah, and that the CIA, and more beyond the CIA, I think the whole national security apparatus around Kennedy, and then subsequently even more around Johnson, were favorable, gradually became favorable to the idea of initially reining Nkrumah in because they thought he was too progressive, too independent-minded, and then ultimately to overthrow him. The transition from reining him in to overthrowing him happened because of Nkrumah's support for Patrice Lumumba in Congo. So in 1960, Patrice Lumumba, so first of all, Patrice Lumumba, who had an undistinguished past as a politician, comes to Ghana in 1958 to attend an African independence-minded conference that Nkrumah had organized, and he becomes totally radicalized. Lumumba goes back to Congo. Out of nowhere, Lumumba becomes this, driven character who says, we have to become independent right now. And of course, you know the end of that story too, probably, that he gets elected and then overthrown. He, first of all, undone, his new government gets undone by the Belgians, who support separatist groups right away after Lumumba's election. Nkrumah supports Patrice Lumumba. Nkrumah deploys some of the first UN peacekeeping forces that ever deployed in the world on behalf of Lumumba to help stabilize his government against the efforts by Belgium to overthrow Lumumba. And this creates a tension with Washington for geopolitical reasons, because even though Kennedy didn't necessarily think, wasn't convinced that Nkrumah is some dangerous communist, Washington really did think that Lumumba was a kind of scary character, that he's unpredictable and rash and has a kind of hyper-excited language and odd behavior, right? And so not only did Nkrumah support Lumumba through peacekeeping and through budgetary support and things like that, but he held the West's feet to the fire at the UN and internationally in other venues, criticizing Washington vocally, expressly, about its hypocrisy for, saying it was in favor of African independence, but in fact working against independence forces in places like the Congo. And I think this really ticked off what I've been calling the national security apparatus, and helped turn that crowd against Nkrumah ultimately after Kennedy is shot under Johnson. And so your initial question, I'm sorry to have been long here, was what about the CIA? The CIA knew that Nkrumah had been the subject of multiple assassination attempts. The CIA knew about some of them ahead of time or in real time. The CIA certainly knew about the successful overthrow of Nkrumah beforehand. And the question that remains unanswered in an absolute sense is, to what degree did the CIA actually help in the planning or give a definitive green light or any other kind of support for this?
I have so many more questions, but I've been signaled, and the person with the mic is here for people who want to ask a question.
Oh, okay. Thank you so much. It's such a privilege to have both of you, Professor Gordon Reed and Professor French, here. I have two questions. One is your research process. You gave a lot of stories, particularly about Nkrumah's early life, having come of age in the 60s. I was really excited and named my son, his middle name, I named him after Kwame Nkrumah. I was so excited about that. So I'd like to know what your research process was. How did you get access to all of those stories? And then second, when we think about what's going on now in Burkina Faso, I think about the analogy between what Kwame Nkrumah was doing and what is happening in Burkina Faso, and just would like to hear your thoughts on that. Thank you.
Thank you. So my research process occurred on several levels. One of them is lived experience, having dwelled in that neighborhood and the environment of Ghanaian politics and knowing a lot of people for a long time there. I've been involved with Ghana since my first visit to Ghana was 1975, which is a long time ago, it seems. The rest of the experience was just typical archival stuff. I mean, you'd be surprised how much national security correspondence and documentation is available through declassification. And so I read a tremendous amount of that. I read a lot of pretty much all of the sort of available kind of standard histories of, this is not just really a book about Ghana, but of related histories of the world in that time. And some of the reviews of the book a couple of them have said, and I don't mind this, but the word sprawling has occurred twice. No. In general, no. There are some instances, but there's no pretension of, that was not my aim or design for the book, to make it a kind of living history of, I know, for example, people who worked with Nkrumah, but I didn't want to make it a book about here's what they remember or here's what they have to say. I was trying to work through documents about what can be known, what does the paper trail tell us about different things, right? What people remember, it's not invalid, it has value, right? But what people remember about things is a very different kind of, a very different world of storytelling than an archival-based history. And so I went with the archival approach. Burkina Faso, I'm not really sure if the audience will follow, how much the audience will follow this. This is a neighboring country of Ghana is in the Sahel region, and I talk about it in the book. Annette asked me before we came out about what has become of Pan-Africanism, which I think is an excellent question, which we didn't really get to talk about because of shortness of time. But in one sense, Pan-Africanism was, we were saying, very much alive in our infancy and youth. Our parents, both of our parents, or both sets of parents, kind of were steeped in that moment. It was a big deal among African Americans of people born in their generation. And my parents were members of a small group in the late 1950s called Friends of Ghana in Washington, D.C., which is mostly African Americans trying to find out ways to help this new government in this newly independent country, right? Annette said to me, and I think she's right, that what happened to all of that? Like, where did all of this go? Like, with this, there was this energy and momentum and idealism and kind of consciousness about Africa that linked African Americans and Africa somehow seemingly much more strongly in that back in those days. And I think on one level that's absolutely true. On another level, I'm not really answering your question here, but I hope you won't be disappointed. On another level, I think actually there's still a lot of Pan-Africanism. One piece of it is in Burkina. So Burkina has a military government who I think the jury is still out on. I mean, they have a nationalist and Pan-African kind of rhetoric about them, and they have rejected French neocolonialism, which any Pan-Africanist would do, right? But the more interesting instance of Pan-Africanism from this country called Burkina involves a guy named Thomas Sankara, who ruled that country in the 1980s, who I knew personally, and who was directly inspired by Nkrumah, and who comes up very late in the sort of personal parts of the book where I close. Sankara was the most interesting and I think important avatar of Pan-Africanism in the post-Nkrumah era. And I just want to close by saying your question, this is the part where I really don't answer you, but I want to close by saying that with regard to Annette's topic, there is a kind of Pan-Africanism still. It's not the type that our parents knew or were involved in, but you know, if you go to Accra or you go to various other, and you have been, you know, there are a lot of African Americans who have made the move to Africa, who have sustained a notion of the importance of the connection to Africa or of Africa as a homeland, and that's still alive, and you can find important strains of this in music in the United States and in certain pieces of youth culture. So I don't want to be too conclusive about saying it was alive and it's dead or you know, something like that.
Okay. Hello. I'm over here. Hi.
Thank you.
Thank you so much for this conversation. It's been so amazing, so thrilling. Born in Blackness is a beautiful book. I just got back from Ghana 10 days ago, so I was one of those African American tourists. I went with a dozen other African Americans from their 20s to their 70s, and I don't think you totally stole the thunder from my question, but I'm thinking about I'm sort of struck by this relationship between the Pan-African story, that touches on Nkrumah, Du Bois, and the tourism, right? The sort of unbridled tourism. If anyone's been Black and gone to Ghana, I feel like I was asked to welcome home to Africa, and people were sort of my heartstrings were being pulled on at the same time that I was being asked to hand over money to buy things. There's lots of Black Greek letter organizations, painted onto presumably African objects. There's this really interesting, I think, relationship between tourism and the kind of and this Pan-African story. Sorry, my question isn't coming out very clearly, but I'm really interested in how you're understanding that flow of capital. How you're understanding the notion of the year of return, where the Ghanaian government invites African Americans back. What does Pan-Africanism mean today? in this context of tourism? I guess that's my question. Thanks.
Okay, thank you. And thank you for your nice words about Born in Blackness as well. So Annette and I had this really rich conversation before we came out here. And she asked me, what did Nkrumah get right and what did he get wrong? Which is actually a really good question. And I could spend the next few hours talking about that, and we don't have a few hours. But one of the things Nkrumah got right, I think, was Pan-Africanism and the idea, a kind of political science notion that Africa, as constituted by the Europeans, is made up of a number of states that are probably, by virtue of their size or configuration, not really going to be very viable for the long term, right? And therefore, something has to be done about that. So he was right about that. He was also right, Nkrumah, on something that relates to your question and to the previous question, but hasn't really been addressed explicitly yet. And that is of the need of the necessity for Africans and African Americans to build a relationship such that they are each other's principal resource. And I don't mean heartstring resource. Heartstrings are great. That's important. I don't want to make light of anybody who takes, I'm going to the homeland and it feels good. That's fine. I'm talking about something else. I'm talking about something beyond that, which says that structures have to be built and movements have to be sustained and capital has to move around and people have to mobilize efforts that bring people together around this idea for it to make a deeper impact on the fortunes. I don't mean like the Americans are being charitable toward Africans. I mean the fortunes of peoples on both sides of the Atlantic. And I think Nkrumah, by beginning with his first exposure, his first days in Harlem and his time at Lincoln University and his exposure to Garvey and Du Bois, Nkrumah understood this and was working for this. Nkrumah was so important. This didn't even really come up at all tonight. There's a lot of the American civil rights movement in this book. And, Nkrumah and Ghana were deeply involved in this as a source of inspiration and ideas and motivation. And so this is a two-way traffic that needs to be increased and sustained and has an enormous and largely untapped potential that I think is the work of people who think of Pan-Africanism as something important to pursue.
I knew Abena Busia, whose father was an opposition leader, and some sense maybe from her also is that Nkrumah's governance and internally, what would you say about what he accomplished, what was done for the country and for people?
I'm sorry, you trailed off and I didn't catch the question. Yeah, I heard who you knew, but I didn't. What's the question?
Well, just his governance. Because my sense is there was a lot of internal disagreement, and just it's separate from your Pan-African topic, but how did he govern? What did he accomplish? Or what was accomplished under him? Or
So, this is naturally going to would have to be a very complicated answer. I would start with he created a school system that sent most Ghanaians to school for free. The British had been in Ghana for how many decades? They never did that. He electrified Ghana. The British, who had been in Ghana for how many decades? They never did that. The roads in Ghana are not what they should be today, but the roads such as they are in Ghana, he oversaw their construction. The British were there for how many decades? They didn't do that. He created a University of Science and Technology and a whole national university system. The British were in Ghana for many decades. They never did that. So it's possible to build a picture of Nkrumah where you say, let's focus on, look, he did this, he did that in terms of failings, and I'm happy to talk about his failings. Nkrumah, his government kind of span out of control, largely driven, I think, initially from falling economic prospects, which I addressed earlier. But I don't think that to focus one's attention that way loses sight of the big picture of what Nkrumah did, and I don't think that that's appropriate. I know the Busia family. By the way, I had lunch with her myself in Accra a few weeks ago. So I know these are people who her father succeeded Nkrumah. There's an appropriate discussion about who Nkrumah jailed. Nkrumah did not jail people en masse. Nkrumah did not execute people, as has happened in other places. But and I'm not addressing this in a way that suggests criticism of you, or even your question. But when I hear this question, what it tends to leave out is the fact that the British did not respect habeas corpus in Ghana. The British arrested people. Nkrumah himself was thrown in jail for having organized a riot that he had nothing to do with, and won an election from inside jail. The British closed newspapers, smashed their printing presses in the colonial era. But the story we are often left with is, how is it that Nkrumah turned bad and did these things? And I think part of the answer, not to create excuses for Nkrumah, I have no need to do that really, is that you need to look at the whole picture. And the whole picture, when one looks at the whole picture, Westerners tend not to remember or be able to conceive of the idea that the rhetoric that we embrace, and I embrace too as Westerners, about political liberties and human rights and things like that, are not things that Westerners have themselves promoted in any consistent way in the world, and particularly in the colonial world that we're talking about. And so one has to see Nkrumah's experience in that entire context.
Oh, yeah, sure. During the 1960s, many newly independent nations had a path laid out in front of them of aligning themselves with the United States or aligning themselves with the Soviet Union. Several African states, such as Ghana, Nigeria, Kenya, initially showed some openness to working with the United States. What factors explain this sort of early willingness to cooperate with America, especially given the United States' own racial inequality, something that Kwame Nkrumah would have had exposure to as well, given his time at Lincoln University, being able to experience the racism and see it impact people around him, while then later exhibiting an openness to work with this widely known racist government?
Thank you. You mentioned other countries. I'm just going to limit my answer to Ghana. It's a valid question. We could go country by country. I'm just going to speak about Nkrumah for the moment. I think Nkrumah's challenge, as he understood it, was how to walk his country, how to lead his country into a state of modernity in terms of the economic nature and political structure of the country on Africa's own terms. And on Africa's own terms means, as I understand it, or as it meant to him as I understand it, how can we make our relationships work with other people, non-Africans, to our advantage? And that means if you don't want to work with us to our advantage, if you have nothing to say to us that addresses our sense of our needs, then fine, we don't need to pursue that with you. We'll pursue our needs in engaging with other people. And this is part of what drove what I kept referring to as the national security apparatus crazy about Nkrumah, because he would tell them straight up, you may think this or that about what Africa should be or how Ghana should be or which direction I should go in, But I have a Ghanaian perspective on that, and that's what I'm here to pursue. And they were not used to being talked to that way. So, you know, it's true that the United States was a racist country. Guess what? It's still true that the United States is a racist country, right? Does that mean that another country should just skip dealing with the United States? No, I don't think so. I'm not in charge of a country. I would think, though, that what that means is if you are the leader of another country, you have to be able to construct a dialogue with the United States that says, here's who we are. Do you want to respect us and work with us in a way that supports our mutual interests? Can there be some mutual interests or not? And if not, then go figure out some other way forward in the world.
You've got the mic.
First of all, I wanted to thank you both for a terrific discussion, and I wanted to thank you for your Born in Blackness book. I'm really curious about whether or not Nkrumah's vision for Pan-Africanism, how it engaged with, or didn't, I don't know, with ideas of socialism, because given that anti-colonial movements in those decades were, by necessity, had to be nationalistic, right? In Vietnam, or, you know, and I think of leaders like Nyerere or Amilcar Cabral, being sort of, in a sense, trying to create this pathway, as you say, what can we do to develop our country as opposed to be underdeveloped? But if we're stuck within the nation state thing, how does that, we're ill-equipped to navigate Western big business and capital. So I'm curious whether or not Nkrumah's Pan-Africanism had a vision of something that would, you know, create sort of like socialism on a bigger scale than the attempt country by country, which typically ended up in failure. It was just, you know, couldn't compete, right? And couldn't get over the centuries of underdevelopment. So
Nkrumah was explicitly a socialist. He embraced that term. Nkrumah also, as we've already stated here, believed that the legacy the polities that were left behind by colonialism were not going to be viable in the future. I think that's true. Most African countries are not displaying a great deal of viability right now. And one way of understanding that might be that Nkrumah was right, that in fact having lots of small, many of them landlocked countries is not going to produce prosperity for Africans, right? So you said socialism in one small place. Nkrumah was a socialist. Nkrumah's socialism was a little bit woolly, and Nkrumah was a guy who, I used the word versatile early in the book, and I tried to introduce the French sense of the word versatile. In French, versatile means changeable. And so Nkrumah was versatile in that sense. He was constantly molding and changing. You can't say, okay, here's the Nkrumah socialism and it's one thing and it was fixed and you can kind of address it as a concrete ideology. But he was a socialist in a broad sense of the word who thought that the path forward for Africa was not building socialism in one small place, but building larger unities that could fend for themselves more in the world. And to come back to the gentleman's earlier question, Nkrumah was under no illusion that the United States, the Soviet Union, China, or anybody else was going to develop Africa. Africa had to develop Africa. And the way to develop Africa was breaking out of these 1, 2, 3, 50 small space realities and building bigger unities.
We have time for just one more question. And then afterwards, you can continue your conversations with Howard at the front as he signs books.
Thank you. Africa Building Africa is embedded in me based on Nkrumah. Now, is it not true that there were a group of African leaders who were coming together in a conference in Central America or South America to do just that? and it was undermined by the international military or whatever we want to call them. And also, what is the implication of the World Bank and all of these corporations that are involved in the economics of the African countries that make it difficult for this Pan-African theory of African Americans and Africans coming together when you have no control over the international economic system that has been supported and developed by African people and African American people who were not paid? So that's my question. How do you have a theory of us doing all of these things when the economics, the corporations, and the development is being undermined and the country's mineral resources are being exploited? What is your take on that?
Thank you, my sister. You really have a high opinion of me, don't you? I've been.
I really appreciate your presentation. And she's my, and I just want to make one other comment. Thurgood Marshall was at Lincoln during the 30s.
He's in the book.
Yeah, okay. And all of the people there were not necessarily bougie. They were told that you got to empower yourself so you can empower people.
Right.
That was the theory that I
Right. So if you, if you read history, you will see, for example, the signal feature of British Empire was make people open the colonies, their territories to trade. Why did the British want to open territories to trade? Because the British controlled the seas and because the British were the leading industrial power of the world, okay? It's very logical from a British point of view, right? So at a certain point, the United States becomes the most powerful economic country in the world. And the foundation of America's economic power, I would say, or certainly a foundation of America's economic power, is finance and banking and capital, right? And so you invoke the World Bank. What does the World Bank, historically speaking, what has the priority of the World Bank been? The World Bank's priority has been, you've got to open your financial markets. You can't have closed off financial markets or currencies that you govern, willy-nilly according to your own desires. You have to, get in with our way of understanding the workings of finances. Our way means beneficial to us, right? Power is, I don't want to use a bad word. Power is a, fill in the word, it begins with a B. When there's a huge disproportion of power in the world, the powerful, how does it go? Do what they can, and the weak do what they must? Right. That's how it works historically speaking. And this is just an unfortunate, I joked with you about your having faith in my ability to answer the question. I don't have the answer to that question altogether. What I can say is that people shouldn't give up, and that people need to dream, and dreams shouldn't stop in bed, and that when you wake up, remember them, and try to work for them, and let's see what happens. Oh, I agree, and we shouldn't stop. And Nkrumah's dream, which I think has a certain amount of wisdom and salience to it, as I've insisted throughout this event, has been that Africans have to come together and reconstitute their continent, and that Africans and the African diaspora have to reinvent their relationship and reinforce it and strengthen it. And I think both of those are eminently sensible priorities.
With a pen?
Could have gone for another hour. Could have gone for another hour. Really, really fantastic. That was a wonderful conversation. Oh, yeah. Oh.